I'm very excited to introduce this awesome panel of really diverse perspectives about the role that data and research could play in improving education in our city. So I will actually start first by introducing our moderator. Our moderator today is Councilor Brian Worrell. And the Councilor is a really leading champion in our city. Even though he's a first-term Councilor, has really been leading the way on championing the use of data to improve decision-making, to understand the impact of our public and private investments, especially in support of youth and families. And his Cradle to Careers data systems work at the City Council is really paving the way for a stronger data infrastructure that will inform policy for years to come. So really excited to have the Councilor here to moderate our panel. But he's not the only awesome guest we have today. We also have 4 awesome panelists. First is Claire Carney, who is a principal at the Bradley Elementary School in East Boston and a longtime BPS teacher, school leader. Next, we have Lashaunda Watson. She is a Boston Public School parent of 4 children and a member of the Family Advisory Board of the education advocacy group School Facts Boston. Next, we have Edith Bazile, who is the founder and executive director of Black Advocates for Educational Excellence. Edith is a former BPS student, parent, and has worked 32 years in Boston Public Schools as a teacher and district administrator. And last but certainly not least, we have Ajanee Igharo, who is a senior at Boston Latin Academy and the president of the Boston Student Advisory Council. So please just give a short round of applause for all of our panelists today. We are so lucky to have them and share their perspectives. And the way this session is going to work is we'll have the first half will essentially be this panel moderated by the Councilor. And then we're gonna move into some brainstorming and thinking about what are the most pressing research questions in education and what kinds of data systems might we need to be able to answer those. And I'll say more about that after. But without further ado, welcome Councilor Worrell. I'll hand it off to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Worrell, and I want the District 4 Boston City Councilor, and I'm also, most importantly, a Northeastern alumni. So it feels good to be back here on Northeastern's campus talking about education. I also want to give another round of applause to our panelists for joining us, and also for Bari and Boston School Fund for putting together this important conversation. I strongly believe that education is the foundation and that a quality education should not only be limited to a select few, it needs to be the standard. What we are driving our students towards will influence how we prepare them. Since data is often used to track or evaluate progress towards goals, first I'd like to hear from each of our panelists about what their educational goals are for ourselves, our children, and for our students. From each of you, what do you think our educational system should be driving our students towards, and what are the most important outcomes? I would like to start with Edith first.
So thank you. Can you hear me okay?
I don't think the mic's...
Can you hear me now? Yes, it's working. Thank you so much. I want to thank the Bari for inviting me here. I'm so excited to be here today. I also want to thank Carrie Donahue from School Funds and Councilor Morrell. I want to start off with a personal narrative. I am sitting on a campus from which I graduated. I am also an alum, and my experience here was quite unique. So I grew up in Roxbury with 13 siblings, and we were very poor. Our parents owned our home. However, we went to school and we didn't have much. We went without lunch, and so essentially, we came from a trauma-infused environment. And during my schooling, I knew that I wanted to go to college. However, when I got to high school, my guidance counselor told me I was not college material. I love to read. And I'll tell you real quickly, in 7th grade, I wrote a piece of poetry because I loved writing, I loved literature, and I was a very imaginative but quiet child. And so I proudly passed on this piece of literature, and my teacher never gave me my piece of work back. And so when I asked him, I raised my hand, I was very shy. I asked him, where's my assignment? And he said, see me after class. Long story short, my teacher didn't believe that I wrote the poem and interrogated me and asked me where I got the poem from and asked me did I know what plagiarism was? And I said no. And so he tore it up and gave me a failing grade. My point is that throughout my years in Boston Public Schools, and when I graduated from the Burke, I was not seen as a child who had the skill or ability to go to college because I was poor and because I was black. Now, my teachers were not mean. They thought they were doing the right thing. And sometimes our students are invisible. I was in a work-study program, so instead of going to class after lunch, I went to work at Polaroid. And I used to ride my bike because I couldn't afford the bus. And so I one time veered down Huntington Avenue and I saw this huge campus, and I said to myself, that's where I want to go to school. When I graduated at 17, I came on this campus and spent the whole day. I didn't know about the application process, but I went from office to office asking, how do I get into this school, until I ran into Dean Latham. And Dean Latham saw some potential in me and helped me. My transcript was poor. I didn't have the prerequisite courses. I didn't have the rigor. And I wasn't exposed to college prep work. So I had to go to MIT as I worked full-time at Polaroid at nighttime and take remedial courses. My point is that we need to use research, but we also need to see our students as having potential and create a pathway for college for all of them. I just want to emphasize that my teachers were not being mean when they said, you're not college material. You can't go to college. You'll be unhappy. You'll fail. They thought they were doing the right thing. So my question is, yes, we need to use the right lens of research to determine how we create pathways to black and brown students, students with disabilities, and English learners whom we often leave behind. And so the question is, how do we unpack that research and data to ensure that that happens for every single student and not leave them behind? Sadly, some of my siblings, because they didn't go to college, did not have the opportunity to take advantage of the rich resources that exist in our city through employment and housing and things of that nature. I was able to capture that middle-class lifestyle and take advantage of opportunities. So research and science is a pathway to success for all of our students, and we have to be cognizant of how we use it for those populations that have been left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Edith. And Claire, would you like to go next?
Sure, thank you. Just listening to Edith speak about that, I think one of my goals as a school administrator and really an educator in the city of Boston is to think about making sure that all of our students and families feel seen and feel visible. Part of that is thinking about how we incorporate all of our students' identity into the work that we're doing at our school. Identity is incredibly important because each individual should be valued as a member of our community. We also want to think about the mastery of the standards that students need in order to achieve college and career readiness. So what is it that we want our students to be able to do when they graduate so that they are prepared for post-secondary education as well? We want to make sure that our kids have those access to STEAM, right? So science. We just had a conversation at my school the other day about really preparing kids and making sure that not only are they getting incredible opportunities at school to collaborate together and to become critical readers and writers and thinkers, right? But like, what are those skills that they really need to be successful beyond a K-12 education? So identity, mastery of the standards, and then thinking about creativity. So just posed the question to my staff the other day around, what's a lesson or some kind of experience that you had in your education that still sticks with you today? And they went, all the way, some people even gave examples from college or even from kindergarten, right, of all these lessons and experiences. And we thought about what they had in common. One of the big things that they had in common was that they were creative, right? That kids got to do the exploration themselves. Somebody wasn't telling them what to explore or telling them what to think, but they themselves got to engage in hands-on learning with their classmates and even out into their communities so that they could learn themselves through that experience. And so thinking about, again, valuing our students' identities, the mastery of important standards and skills that are gonna be prerequisites for college and career. And then lastly, this idea of creativity. How are we really engaging kids in their own learning to make the meaning relevant to their lives and to make some of the ways that we're assessing kids really meaningful to them?
Thank you for sharing. And Ajanee or Lashaunda? All right.
I don't know if is this on? Okay,
Yes.
it's on. Hi. When it comes to what I feel like every student should be able to take away from their education, for one, I want students to be able to understand and feel confident in their ability to make choices for themselves after they graduate. A lot of people don't know about career paths other than college or like 9-to-5 jobs. I want people to understand that if those type of things do not work for you, there are other things that you can do and still be happy and succeed in. On top of that, I want people to be able to apply the things that they learn instead of just like regurgitating it onto paper and forgetting it. I want them to be interested in learning, and I want them to continue to want to pursue it and apply it to their life.
Thank you. I agree. I'm in agreement with everything everyone is saying up here. I was educated in the Braintree Public School System through the METCO program. And the narrative for us was, you're lucky to be here. And it never sat well with me because I always felt like every single person should be afforded this kind of education. It shouldn't be something that's the luck of the draw. Everyone should be afforded that type of education. And so when the vision that I see for students is that everyone has access to quality education, of course, the core classes and the things that would help them to be successful in college, but I feel like we're in such a unique place being in Massachusetts. You can't throw a stone without hitting an amazing institution right here in our state, and we're lucky in that sense. I feel like engagement needs to begin at the cradle. Because kids that I went to school with, they were wearing MIT onesies. I mean, they were prepped and ready, and they knew that that was an opportunity that was afforded to them. So, we got people coming all over the world, from everywhere, from every corner of the planet, to be educated right here in our state. So the same should be true for the kids that are growing up in the projects across the street from Northeastern. So I just want that to be accessible for everyone. Green space, up-to-date technology, wonderful extracurricular activities, even opportunities to give back, because even poor kids have something to give, and they should see themselves as the broader community, as a part of the broader community, and not only that, as a part of the global community. So that's the vision that I see.
Yeah, those are great goals. And a little bit about me, I went to METCO as well, and my parents grew up pretty poor. I didn't realize I was poor until I got a little older in life. And if it wasn't for Balfour Academy here on Northeastern's campus, who gave me a full ride to Northeastern, I would never have went to college. And I owe a lot to those guys who poured into me. And I want to make sure, like to your point, Lashaunda, that quality education is not only limited, for Black and brown people who get into METCO or to the exam schools, that should be an opportunity that everyone has, right, for quality education. But now that we have established a few of our goals, how do we know if we're on track? Do you feel like you have all the kinds of data that you would need to understand whether or not you are making progress toward the outcomes you mentioned, and what do you feel is missing?
I think we have to begin with the end in mind, and that's a Stephen Covey quote, and outcomes matter, but outcomes are the equalizer as well. So we need universal pre-K, and luckily we live in a city where there's a commitment to provide universal pre-K. We know the earlier we have students, the more of a chance we have to build a strong literacy foundation. And I really do believe that's where it starts. Children being able to use language, children being able to independently access printed text, to write well, to talk about what they've read, but also to see themselves reflected in the curriculum. That is so critical. We need to start with what are students' strengths. A lot of times we say they're poor, and I was poor, but I was eager to learn. Poverty creates stress, but it doesn't impact on a student's ability to learn. We need to know what they know and can do in their own cultural ways, whether they speak English or not. There are cultural funds of information and there are bodies of knowledge that all children carry that are not reflected in the curriculum, and we need to unpack that. You know, often we say children have suffered learning loss because of the pandemic, but we also need to ask, what if we lost in terms of reimagining how we educate students in this pandemic? So we need to look at district learning loss, and we need to look at who we leave behind. Things that we measure are important, but sometimes we don't measure the things that are critical to a child's development. Do I see myself reflected in the curriculum? Do I see someone who looks like me in my classroom or is a school leader? Children need to see what they can possibly be. I didn't have any black teachers when I went to Boston Public Schools. I didn't see myself reflected in the curriculum. And when I did hear about black folks, it was negative, it wasn't positive. And so we need to talk about race and racism. We have students who come from 135 countries. We need to talk about what is the best pedagogical approach to ensure that our English learners are developing literacy. For me, literacy is the foundation. We know that 1 in 5 students will struggle with the way we teach reading. Now, I said the way we teach reading, and we often call these students neurodiverse. That doesn't mean they have a disability. It means, you know, I'm 5'4", you're 6'1", and we're different. And so those differences often are labeled or stigmatized as, well, you need an intervention. Well, if 20%, 1 in 5 students learn to read differently, we need to have that as a pathway. And universal screening is something we need to do before kindergarten. We can predict students who will struggle with literacy before kindergarten. And we need to identify, well, you know, this student needs something that's more systematic, that's rule-based, that is cumulative, and we have research to prove that we can get those outcomes. And we need to monitor progress, track the data, and assess how we are doing. An assessment of children is not assessment of children, it's an assessment of society. How do we organize our schools, and how do we organize adults so they are learning professionally how to be effective with a demographic population that is not going to change? Because we have black students now that are still underachieving. We have Latinx students who are underachieving. Why? We have the research and we have the science. We need to put that to work. So I say, let's begin with having a strength-based approach and not say they're poor, they come from a large family or a single family, or they're in foster care. No excuses. Let's look at our demographic population and import science and roll up our sleeves and do what we know is going to get them to where I am, because some of my siblings did not go to college. And I would venture to say that Dean Latham not only gave me a chance, but he also saved my life. And so it is about saving children's lives and for them seeing themselves as part of society. Thank you.
Yep, and anyone feel free to jump in.
Can you repeat the question, please?
How do we know if we're on track with our goals? Do you feel like you have all the kinds of data that you would need to understand whether or not you are making progress towards the outcomes you mentioned? And what do you feel is missing?
I completely agree with what Edith said about how people are being tested. I feel like it's a lot of math and reading and numbers and just like if you have an 80, that means you're smart. And if you have a 45, that means you don't know how to do anything. And there are different types of intelligence that I feel like need to be assessed in students. There are ways that people can apply their knowledge that isn't just feeling like circling numbers and things like that. People need to be able to prove their intelligence by applying it to the world or choosing something that they're interested to talk about, because we know that one size does not fit everyone. So I just feel like assessments are not there's not enough variety.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think that the way that we assess kids needs to shift, right? And so we need to think about the different kinds of assessments and products that students can create to demonstrate an understanding. I also think, Edith, to your point around the data that we're collecting from the time that students, where we do these universal screeners and they're in pre-K, what are the strategies that are working? What training do our educators need and our families need to support every learner in our schools, every child in our schools? And how can we make sure that we have that data for every child across the city of Boston, and that we're elevating those strategies that are working for all of our students? And so one of the things that I think is a huge gap right now is thinking about, if a student comes to me from the Blackstone and I don't have the same curriculum, or I don't need the same curriculum, but I don't have the same kind of data that the prior school is using, even within the Boston Public Schools, my ability then to put in place interventions to support that student, I don't know what's been tried before, right? And that's even within the city of Boston. So add to that students coming from in and out of state or other districts. And we've seen a lot of movement, right? Especially during COVID. So that's one thing. I also think, to your point around what are the other skills that we want students to have going into when they graduate from the Boston Public Schools? What are the skills that we want students to have to understand that you have to listen to the people around you, and that your life and the kind of your position here in Boston, maybe you live on Saratoga Street in East Boston, but you're part of a global society, right? And so what are the different skills that you need to interact with people who grew up in Mattapan, who grew up in California, who grew up in India? We need to have conversations with our kids, and we need to have some metrics to determine how are students able to interact with each other? What are the social justice standards that we want to have for our students to understand I can recognize that somebody else has a different identity than what I have, and I'm going to support and acknowledge that identity and celebrate that in the person sitting next to me. And if we can really start identifying those skills that we want to have for our kids from 3 years old all the way up through 12th grade, we're going to graduate a different kind of global citizen, a different contributor to society, somebody who's going to sit on the city council with you and be able to listen to you even if they disagree with you, so that we can make progress as a community.
And I'll ask the next question that's a very good lead into the next question. Alexander Graham Bell said, before anything else, preparation is the key to success. So staying on track with our goals is essential. What barriers do you face in trying to access data or research that will allow you to make better decisions or inform you on your understanding of your progress?
I would say that I would like to know when school committee meetings are happening real time. I'd like to know where the funds are going, and what policies are going to impact the schools that my kids go to. And I also want to know kind of how I wish there was a mechanism where my child could kind of check in before school starts to see how she's feeling. Maybe, she's angry that day. Maybe she's just having a rough day and she's depressed. She's struggled a lot, with her mental health since COVID. And we've had some really, really tough days. And if there was a mechanism that checked in with each student to say, hey, before the school day starts, how are you feeling, kind of on a scale. Maybe there could be interventions before the blow up, and please, all the educators in the room, keep me honest. I'm not sure if teachers are equipped to deal with that level of, I don't know, behavioral health type of crisis. So if there were counselors on site that said, okay, well, this group of students is struggling, let's get them out of the classroom, let's talk to them, before they start to interrupt the rest of the students' education, that would be helpful for me to know as a parent.
I would add to that as well, because parents are the first teachers. And so I think, schools struggle with family and community engagement. We know that it takes a whole community to educate children. And, often schools say, well, we're going to empower parents. Well, parents already have power. We have children 6 hours a day. Parents have them 18 hours plus the weekend. And so the parents are the experts. And how do we center parents so that when they come to school, it's not for a problem, but it's because we're developing a partnership. And they're not just at the table, they are collaboratively making decisions. And so we need to leverage our parents and have policies that are responsive. Often we react instead of responding. When is a good time for you to come up for a conference? Budgetary decisions, everything that schools do is part of involving the public and serving the public. So it's really critical to have the parent engaged, even with, what are your child's strengths? Even if they say, well, my child cooks and takes out the trash and helps siblings with problem solving and, has a little side job, how do we really get to know students as a whole person? And how do we educate the whole child? And we have to do that in collaboration with parents and suspend our assumptions about what we think we know. Creating pathways for students means, just like when you go to work, if your boss doesn't like you, you know it, and you're not going to put forth a lot of effort, right? And so work is going to be a place that you don't feel empowered. Well, what do we know about students to really create a culture of belonging, a culture of safety, a culture where the students' gifts, strengths, and talents are not only acknowledged, but they have opportunities for leadership. And there's equity in that. Are we exposing students to rigorous opportunities like advanced work class or exam school admission? And who are we leaving behind? And if we don't answer those questions, we, and I say as a district, as a society, will continue to perpetuate injustices. And so student voice is important. Students should be empowered about what's happening at their school. Is this policy working? Whether it's attendance or discipline, a code of discipline. So engaging a whole community. And then, of course, working with agencies as well as your community partners who help with funding and with after-school programs and summer opportunities and internships. So it really takes a whole community to support a school, but it begins with centering the child and centering the parent, and really ensuring that their voice and input is folded into decision-making.
I think to your point about families, my son is going into BPS next year, and thinking about what are the metrics that different schools are using across the Boston Public Schools to measure all of these things that we're talking about, right? Whether it's mental health, whether it's social justice, whether it's mastery toward the content standards, right? How are we measuring that? What are the assessments that we're giving students? Because if we don't have a common set of assessments across schools, we're not actually able to see what's working and what's not working within our schools. And then similarly, as a parent, I want to know not only what assessments my kid is getting, but what do the assessments mean, like a real understanding of what the assessments mean, what my kid's growth means, what the options are for intervening and accelerating as needed. Because I think we talk a lot about interventions. It's accelerations for every kid, right? Because no matter where you are, we're going to plan an acceleration for you. And we don't have common data sources. We don't have common expectations on how we share data with families. To your point about the school committee meetings, how are we identifying a set of goals that can be measured for the Boston School Committee to look at and say, all right, in these schools we've met our targets in these schools we haven't, and here's our plan, or across the Boston Public Schools, here's our plan to address that. And I'm not just talking about math or ELA targets, I'm talking about mental health targets, right? Because without that mental health support, without the relationships with families and that transparency, we aren't going to be able to meet any academic targets.
Awesome. In the effort of centering student voices, we'd love to hear from Ajanee. Like, what are you and your peers talking about? Is there any information that you wish that the school system and the district would be sharing with you? And how difficult is it to access that information as a student?
To start, most students don't even know what the Boston School Committee is. Nobody knows who's making the decisions for us. We just know that we're forced to wake up at 5 o'clock and get to a building filled with hard seats to have people teach at us. So we don't know why school exists. We don't know what we're supposed to be working towards. A lot of people don't know what a good GPA is, or like a GPA to have is. Up until maybe like 9th grade, we're just told you have to get good grades, but we don't know why. We don't know who's making the decisions for us, if they really have our best interests at heart. We don't really see people that represent us, so we don't even know if we can make it, because all of the people that are represented as successful don't look like us, don't come from where we come from, don't share our languages or our culture. So there's that. There's also the fact that we don't know where our people come from, and I feel like that's a big part of your engagement in school, is feeling like you're represented and knowing more about yourself. Everybody needs a sense of identity to feel like a passion towards who they're going to become. You have to know where you came from, and you have to feel inspired to create a legacy for yourself. On top of that, we're not really given the floor when it comes to sharing our experiences. We have people making decisions for us, but I feel like the people closest to the pain need to be explaining what works best for us. A lot of people don't even take the time to think what works better for me, because we feel like it's not going to change regardless. We only have one way that we're being taught, and you either get it or you don't. So I think students need to be encouraged to think critically about what works for them, and then they need to see that reflected in how they're accommodated.
Thank you for sharing, and yeah, that was awesome. That was definitely awesome. Would love to hear the parent perspective. You know, parents want the best for the child, want them to go to good schools, get good grades, and be successful. So what are you able to understand about your child's progress? What would you want to know about your child's school's progress and the whole system in general?
So, I mean, I'm on every committee imaginable to be a part of every decision that's made about my child's school and her education. I know a lot of the administrators, you know, first name basis, so I'm involved directly. So, I mean, beyond just knowing the grades, again, I want to be very, very kind of kept in the know about just her progress. I mean, behavioral health is huge for her. I mean, her grades are wonderful, but she has a lot of bad days, and those bad days impact, you know, her attendance and, you know, my ability to be at work and not worry about her. So I just need open lines of communication, and so. Yeah, I mean, for me, that's just kind of paramount.
And I know talking about data sometimes can be very wonky, and you know, putting numbers on the page could just be that, just numbers on the page. One way I believe we can make data easier to understand is how it's presented. How can we better support parents, students, caregivers to interpret data on educational progress? We can start with Claire.
So I think, again, having a common set of sources across schools. So if in your time in the Boston Public Schools, you go to 3 or 4 schools and they all have different assessments. Every time you're learning, let's say each child has 5 different assessments a year, that's 20 different assessments that you as a family need to learn and understand. And for students to say, how should we measure progress? Here are some of our goals, right? What are some of your goals? And now how are we going to measure it? Let's create a portfolio for each student digitally, right? So they can share it long term and depending on whatever school they go to, that says, how are we going to show evidence of X, Y, and Z? So like as an educator, as a school leader, I'm not necessarily just taking, I don't have a piece of paper with my grades across areas, right? I upload artifacts of the work that I've done. What if we allowed students to do that? What if we allowed families to support their children with that so that we are seeing authentic, we just had our 5th and 6th graders writing podcasts. And when I think about the value of that for our kids, and they were choosing the topic, right? They were researching this, they were given ideas, but then they were choosing, like, this is authentically how I want to express myself, what I want to research. And what are some of the guardrails that we have for showing evidence of mastery of something, but then how is their individual choice and voice and how you show that, right? And I think, I sit down with parents sometimes and they don't want to just hear about, yes, they want to know how their children are doing with reading fluency, but they also want to know, how is my child treating his or her friends in school? How is my child feeling throughout the day? These kind of check-in systems, and what are the data sources? We really need to have a look at, like, what are the data sources that we want to have for each child, so we can track that as things happen. We know that as things happen and children experience different trauma in their lives, that has a huge impact on their emotional well-being, but then also on their grades. And so thinking through, like, how can we grade and measure this across domains so that parents get a full picture of each child and not just these very narrow lines that are defined, that were defined hundreds of years ago that we're still using?
So I would add that, and that was wonderful, that if you are going to evaluate me and I am going to receive that evaluation, you have to prove that you know me. And the data has to be meaningful. And so often what school districts do is they use a lot of educational jargon. They don't present the information in an understandable way to parents, because parents may or may not be educators, and they may not present it in the right language. And so I think that's a conversation. That evaluation has to be a collaborative process where I know what you're saying about me. I can understand why you're saying it, and then there are some suggestions in terms of where do we go from here. And one of the things that we don't often do, and with Ajanee in her statement, we don't really look at the student's perspective. Why am I learning this? How is this meaningful in my life? How is this connected to me demonstrating what I know and can do? Are there other pathways that reflect my interest that I can use as a way of building knowledge to demonstrate the way you want me to show it? And so students come with knowledge and with skills, but sometimes as district, they're measured based upon just the district standard, and it is narrow. And we also need to ensure that we have a culture that says it's okay to make a mistake, that failure is something that we all experience, and we need to make ourselves vulnerable as adults and say, oops, I made a mistake, instead of covering up, and demonstrate to students that we're not perfect either. One of the reasons that I wanted to be a teacher is because when I looked at teachers, in the back of my mind I was saying, I could do a better job. And it was boring, and it wasn't engaging, and I didn't see myself. And I read at home, because even though we were poor, my parents had standards. They never went to school because, my father had 3 jobs, my mother was a full-time caregiver, but they prioritized education. And we need to stop making assumptions that if parents don't show up physically in school, they're not involved. Parents show up in other ways, and we need to acknowledge that. I didn't see teachers who looked like me, so I decided to become the teacher because I was kind of a revolutionary, and I revolted. I was rebellious. I said, well, I wanted to be the teacher that I did not have, and I wanted to do it. I wanted to be an educator that saw children, because I wasn't seen, and that's why I went into education. But that's not the case for most students. So when we evaluate students, we need to figure out what are we missing. You know, what are they interested in? Music, art? Are they athletic? Do they love to travel? Are they interested in reading fantasy or exploratory? Or, you know, so we need to include that to demonstrate to the student when we provide that reporting information that I see you, I hear you, this is what I see. And we need to reflect that I know you, I'm interested in you, and not just checking off the box. You passed, you didn't pass, you know, you're this or that, and get the students' feedback as well.
I agree with everything that has been said so far. I also just want to add that a lot of times at the start of different units and at the start of different curriculums, nobody knows where they're supposed to be by the end of it. And they also are so focused on like making sure their grade is good that they're not really interested in the learning. I feel like students are not that interested in learning because sometimes school takes away from that. You're just told that you have to have a certain number on whatever assessment you're given, and if you don't, you're gonna have bad grades, and then your life will never be good because you're not gonna get into a good college, etc. People are not interested in what they're learning, and they also are sometimes not prepared for the assessments that they're given. They just know that they're getting these assignments, and then they see questions on the test that they never learned, or like they're just doing it to do it. So I feel like people should be better prepared for the assessments and get a better understanding of what they're being assessed on and why it matters.
A lot of great insight and perspectives here on this panel, but what we would like to do is open it up for questions from the audience. And if anyone has a question, raise your hand, and Kerry will go around with the microphone. Need a mic? Right here.
Hi, I'm Judy Shanley from the National Office of Easter Seals. My question is, we hear a lot in academia research the terms research to practice. We want to have tangible results. What does that mean to each of you when we say research to practice?
I think, you know, we always say, you know, how do you take the research and go from theory research to practice, and how do you embed that in the classroom? And so what's missing in between that is the culturally responsive and pedagogy. And so who is that student? So for example, if a student is struggling with reading, I need to create a pathway, but I also need to acknowledge that student's learning style. I need to unpack what I know that student needs in a culturally responsive way and create an environment of learning for that student. And how do I do that well? We need to acknowledge cultural differences, our worldviews, our ways of knowing, our perspective. So I think it's important for schools to not only have a collaborative team where we have the diversity of staff who understand, you know, and can collectively create a true profile of a student, but also determine, you know, what does that look like in action? How do we create an action plan so that we're supporting students who, for example, are struggling with literacy? So how do we incorporate those strategies in the classroom without segregating or separating students? Because we have a lot of good research, but we don't really develop protocols in terms of how we impact that in a lesson. So if we're teaching a lesson and we know that we have to build vocabulary for English learners so that they're able to communicate and engage in discussion, you know, what are the pedagogical practices that are important to use so that it's embedded in the classroom culture and routines, and we are not pulling that student out or targeting or labeling that student. How do we do that well? So it has to do with routines, practices, who can support, what roles do we play in working with other team members, paraprofessionals, librarians, people who, staff that are in the building, even if it's providing social-emotional support, how do we embed that? So how do we create a model of best practice using research so that we have a culture of achievement for all students and we can measure that learning as we're engaging them?
Just very quickly to add on to that, I think one of the points that you brought up earlier was just around teachers, like our educators responsible or capable or able to understand some of these behavioral health things. Remember, like you were talking about that, and I think one of the problems with research to practice and thinking about that is, and how we roll it out is like, we're supposed to be experts in everything. And so what does our professional development look like over the course of the year? What is, for me as an administrator, what is the learning that I'm engaging in, and how are we identifying the goals of our professional learning based on research and saying, these are the areas where our school leaders need to improve, our educators need to improve so that we can improve outcomes for our students. And that time isn't time, right? The time isn't always there to do that and to then practice those things and come back and see if we've actually utilized those research-based practices effectively in our classrooms.
Really add real quickly is like, what is the professional learning and who has done this work successfully? So not only having professional development sessions for teachers to stimulate their growth and development in the research-based practices, but allowing them to visit teachers who are down the road and who are doing it well, and also having that job-embedded coaching, because we don't want to just read an article and discuss it, but we want to make sure that we follow the teachers into the classroom and highlight what they're doing well already, and also connect them to colleagues that are doing this work. And now that we have come from a virtual environment, we can do that. We can connect with school districts and other districts in other states and even around the world even. So there are a lot of possibilities for that type of professional collegial collaboration and partnership.
I have something to add, yes. I feel like on top of educators and teachers teaching people the curriculum, students do a lot of their own work to learn the curriculum. And that's why it's important for each student to learn themselves and understand their own teaching style, because they need to know how they learn best, as well as teachers need to learn how students learn best. Students don't even know how they learn best. So everyone needs to learn themselves and be able to tell their teacher how they learn best, and be able to look at the homework they're given and go to other resources that are on, the internet and et cetera, and be able to help themselves understand things better. That's very important.
I think research is amazing. I think we need it. It's so needed. But I also think lived experience is important too. And I feel like sometimes people, legislators sometimes will use research or lack thereof as a cop-out. And I'm just going to be honest. When you have people that are telling you I'm struggling, you buy yourself time to circle right back to what somebody told you they were struggling, to have the evidence of what we were saying anyway. And I'm just going to be honest. It's needed, absolutely. But listen, just listen well.
Yes, question in the back.
All right. Hello. Hi, so I'm Keandre from the Office of Youth Leadership in BPS and BSAC, and also former school committee rep. So yay. Lashaunda, Lashaunda, all right, so this kind of touches on what you just left off on. I was thinking about how do we use data to dismantle these systems of oppression? Because the data that we do collect is already through a biased, deficit-based lens. And thinking about like recommendations in regards to how do we shift that, like to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, or to make sure the data that we are collecting is used in an adequate manner. So like example, we have, through BSAC, we've worked on the teacher feedback survey that we give. But yet you can only give feedback to like 1 or 2 teachers a year. And it's not even the teachers that are giving you trouble. And then how does that hold the teacher accountable or the educator accountable for shifting their practices in the classroom that are more meaningful and authentic for the young people? Did I have anything else? I forgot. Okay. I might have another part later, but yeah, let's go there.
All right, so if I understand you correctly, the question was about how, I'm sorry, could you just repeat it? Just want to make sure I get this right.
The question was, the question was, how do we use data to dismantle systems of oppression?
Okay.
Edith, in your opinion.
Well, I think it starts with understanding what oppression is in the first place, and what privilege really is in the first place, and acknowledging it, acknowledging that racism exists, acknowledging that there are real systemic issues. There are people that would believe that even in 2022, it just doesn't exist anymore. And I think acknowledgement, it begins with that first. And just believing the people who are, as this young, articulate young lady has said before, people who are closest to the pain, just acknowledging what they're going through, their struggle, their lived experience. It doesn't take numbers to understand that people are really struggling. Just being aware.
And I'd like to add to that as well that policy creates oppression. And we need to look at our policies, our discipline policies, where we know that Black males are targeted. We know that Black girls are, in some cases, 12 times more likely to be suspended or expelled. We need to look at the surveillance of school police and who they're looking at. There was an eye tracking study that was done, and the outcome was preschool teachers were told to look for problem behavior, and they weren't given any other guidance. And so the eye tracking study, it was Gilliam, showed that they were 47 times more likely to look at Black boys. But what we also know is that that's the school to prison pipeline. We know that school police look for criminal behavior. They are not mentors, they're not counselors. And so we need to think about the research that says that the presence of school police does not make schools safer. And why are they in Black and brown communities? We need to look at the disproportionate underfunding, understaffing, and under-resourcing of Black schools in Black communities, and they're disproportionately closed. We have a school in Boston, the Shaw Elementary School, where they're doing great literacy work, but the school is under threat of closure, and we have to ask why. We know that Black teachers are not hired or retained at the same level as their white counterparts. And we need to ask why. And so systemically, we know that when public education was founded right here in Boston in 1635, slavery still existed in Massachusetts and wasn't abolished until almost 150 years later. And so we need to look at the colonial remnants of systems that continue to exist in the school system that target and leave Black students behind from the very early start, where students who are in kindergarten, Black males are suspended in kindergarten and even in preschool. Bettina Loves talks about abolitionist education and really dismantling structures that don't work. But overall, it is the policies that drive. Dr. Gloria Lanson's billing talks about there is an education debt, not an achievement gap or an opportunity gap, but an education debt owed to Black students. We need to look at what happened during desegregation. that has never been acknowledged, the pain, the healing that needs to take place from that. So when you talk about systemic structures of racism and white supremacy, it started with eugenics, which was a false scientific belief coming out of Harvard by Louis Agassiz, who said that Black people just were not hardwired to learn and that we were at the end. So my point is that we have a caste system in education. And in that system, Black folks are at the bottom. And we need to address that and be very clear about calling it out and talking about racism, because we have not had an honest, candid conversation about racism and asked, why are policymakers predominantly white, and why isn't the cultures of BIPOC people reflected in administration? And so it begins there. There's a lot of work for us to do.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi,
Yep.
that was very loud. Thank you for that, Edith. I want to make space for those important comments. But my name is Marinelle Rumanier. I am the CEO of an organization in Boston called EdVestors. And one of the things we do, as some of the panelists know, is recognize the most improving Boston public schools through a $100,000 prize every year. Claire's school was a finalist a couple of years ago. And the Otis Elementary School, who won last year, is doing really interesting work around academic parent-teacher teams, which I think is like one example of a way at the things that Edith and Claire was talking about in terms of how, not just how do you have data, but how do you have real conversation with families. There are also examples of student-led conferencing that exists. And I'm just wondering, like a little bit of maybe upside, are there other bright spots that you would point to, either schools or examples of ways we can bring that data in a way that honors the challenges that we have and shifts the deficits into strengths?
So I think we were just sitting down with our second grade team the other day and thinking about some of the units of study that we are imagining for next year and working through. And one of the great projects they do is a name origin project, where students are researching the origin of their name and sharing that with classmates, and they're interviewing family members. And we're also doing an entire unit on people who changed the world. And so students are interviewing community members in a predominantly immigrant community in East Boston who have changed the world and have changed the community in East Boston through the things that they've accomplished. And so when I think about the data that comes out of that, right, these interviews, I think some of the data that we're looking for to dismantle these systems of oppression also isn't clean, just like numbers, right? Some of this is data that takes more time to organize and to produce, and it's not always quantifiable in the exact same way. And I think that because it's harder, it's something that we tend to shy away from and not do as much of. And so it's going to take, hopefully, as we see a new administration come in this summer, I hope it's a focus of future administrations in the Boston Public Schools to think about what are the ways that we can have authentic data that involves listening to the people around us and involves, these data sources that maybe aren't, clicking on a survey and answering questions or a standardized test, but data that's really important and integral to our understanding of the community we live in the larger community.
I think that's a great question, Marinelle. I couldn't see because I don't have my glasses on, but it's good to see you. I think, yes, we often celebrate failure. We focus on schools that are failing, but we don't look at islands of success where great things are happening, and great things are happening in Boston Public Schools, and replicate those best practices. And so we need to invert that and really think about, what has this school done? Because when schools are successful, we leave them alone. We don't do anything. We start paying attention to schools when they're failing. And so we need to change our perspective and begin to think about, what are the best practices that currently exist? How can we garner institutional knowledge and history and who holds that body of information. We have to look back to move forward, because I worked under the Paysan administration, and we had some wonderful successes. And we need to perpetuate what's good and foster those models and share those experiences, because, you know, often education is a solo journey, and we need to take time and begin to have collaborative conversations across schools, across districts, and around the country. I mean, Massachusetts, the U.S. News and World Report said in 2022, Massachusetts has the best schools in the country. But we also know that we have, if you look at the list, we have schools like the McKinley schools, which is for students with disabilities, that is the worst in the state. So we have the best high schools in the country, but also the worst schools, some of the worst schools in the state. And we need to look at those models and see what we can borrow from that, and begin to look outside the district, not just what we know, but what, you know, what others are doing with the same demographic of students and getting better results. Because that research is available and it's out there, and we need to unpack it and begin to use it.
Thank you. And I would like again thank all of our panelists for sharing. Very great insight and very powerful perspective. What I'll do next is pass it on to Keiko, who would talk about the breakout groups that we're going to next.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keiko Zoll, and I'm with Boston Schools Fund. And thank you again. How about just another round of applause for our amazing panelists, and thank you, Councilor Worrell, for moderating. So you may have seen passed around to your table are some questions that we're going to engage in for the next 20 minutes. You'll have the chance to brainstorm concrete research questions and ideas. Each table should assign a scribe and a presenter to share out highlights at the conclusion of the activity. Your goal is to put on a researcher hat at your table. So you're going to think through 1 to 2 of your top education research questions for Boston. What do you most want to understand about education in Boston? Once you have identified those questions, you will think through the kinds of data that you will need to collect or access, and the kinds of supports that would help you to answer your research questions. Our goal is to create a vision for both the questions we have and the data and systems we need to be able to answer those questions. On your table, you'll find the guided questions to take you through developing your research questions. So you want to be able to answer the following questions about what are 2 possible research questions that you have related to education in Boston. What kinds of data do you think you would need to answer these questions, and where might you source that data? What kinds of data would you want to have that you don't think would be easy to get or might not exist at all? What kind of systems, people, experts, or tools do you think might help you better answer your research questions? And then imagine you've completed this research. What would you want to do with it? Where could it be used or shared, and how would it be applied? Our panelists will join you for this work and float between tables. Feel free to share your ideas and ask questions of our panelists as you work. And I'll let everyone know when there are 5 minutes remaining. Thank you. Some of what they were working on. So if the table that's closest to me could share 1 to 2 highlights from your discussion, that'd be great.
So we haven't had we've mostly been, okay. So I have been thinking, and we all started thinking about the difference in school culture and between schools that have the kind of $1 a plate fundraising events for parents, and then $200 a plate fundraising events for parents, and the kinds of outcomes that can be determined from that kind of thing. So the $200 a plate places have wealthy people that can afford $200 a plate, and the $1 a plate oftentimes are spending a lot of time thinking about school community and having parents interact with each other. And, you know, what are some things that we can study from that?
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Denise Rory from the Office of Youth Leadership. So we were off task, but that's okay. So we came up with 2 questions, though. So we got through the first question. So our first one was, how do we normalize young people being equal participants in decision making? And how do we assess our community's assets with data? So yeah, we were talking a little bit about like, how can we use like data from the whole community to better serve our young people? And like, how can it not just be about like the negative aspects of like, you know, gunshots or broken lights or things like that, but maybe like small businesses or like what community leaders are in the community or what are the other assets that communities have so that we can have a more targeted approach to support young people. So we talked about a lot of other stuff too.